Hi, we're the Chris's, and we would like to welcome you to this presentation on plurality as a whole. We worked on this kind of a map, I guess, of a variety of the different issues in types of plurality. It is not definitive. It is not the whole answer. It is not everything that there is to say on the subject, but it is a good way to give an overview of some of the concerns and some of the types of plurality, as well as in a moment we'll be also talking about different types of headmates within systems. So kind of consider this to be a blanket overview and not an what's the word we're looking for? Not a thorough or complete or conclusive overview, but you will see some of these types of things within the plural community as well as within plural clients if you have clients. So what is plurality? Plurality is anyone who is many. We've had some people say, well, many is more than two, and it's like, no, it can be two or more. So anyone who is two or more within one body, which leaves open the question of two or more what? So many what? Parts, people, alters, spirits, voices, etc. We are not picky. And we'll talk more about what these many present themselves as subjectively in a moment. So this is all based on more or less subjective experience. So these are the experiences of the people who have all of this alphabet soup that's on the screen right now. In terms of clinical observation, let's call it, we do have criteria A tucked over here of the DSM-5. Criteria A is basically the plural criteria of DID. It's the criteria A of dissociative identity disorder. So, it is the disruption of identity. This is what it's observed as, okay? It's observed as a disruption of identity characterized by two or more distinct personality states, which may be described in some cultures as an experience of possession. The disruption of marked continuity in sense of self and sense of agency, accompanied by related alterations in affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, and or sensory motor functioning. This is a mouthful. These signs and symptoms may be observed by others or reported by the individual. If we go further down the page, we translate this into, we go through each of the things that are mentioned and we translate it into English. Where is that? Here we go. So, in more plain English, the existence of two or more observable or reported identities or people sharing a body. I know psychologists are going to argue about me saying people, but anyway, identities or people sharing a body where these two identities are defined as having a distinct sense of self and self-control, separate from each other, including different feelings, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, intellect, senses, and or abilities. So all those fancy jargon words basically come down to feelings, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, intellect, senses, or ability. I will put this aside and continue to explain. Psychology is attempting to be a science, and as a science, it is attempting to observe somebody else. So, psychology is not at all about subjective anything. This particular definition gives that one caveat where somebody can self-report their own subjective experiences. Not many diagnoses have that I know of, but that is the criteria A of DID, that it does include that you can walk into a doctor's office and say, "Hi, doc, I have a lot of people in my head," and the doctor may say, "Well, they're not people, they're parts." But if you self-report people in your head, they may consider DID as a possible diagnosis. the vast majority of my screen is dedicated to plurality. We do want to mention, of course, that there are singlets who have absolutely no hint of anything regarding plurality. They exist, but that the broad spectrum of plurality also can acknowledge that some singlets might have some things going on that represent those criteria of DID, those different things that might be observed by other people. So if we come down here towards the singlet corner of this, we have aspected singlets, and down here, people who used to be people who used to be singular but have chosen to become plural deliberately. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay. Oh, where to dive into this diagram? So we mapped out many different experiences, and in blue, if you cannot see blue, I apologize, in these blue italicized areas around these different spots that I'm pausing at in the screen, we have explanations of, let's say, different aspects of plurality, different theories, or different, I don't know, the je ne sais quoi of plurality, the different, like, stuff that is behind the reason that people may be plural. So we have parallel development of self-states is somewhere around theory of structural dissociation. Here we have subclinical, non-trauma-based plural systems, which includes aspected singlets, or endogenic or natural systems that may have been born that way or developed that way, and so on. So what is the purpose of us creating this whole big map? Is to show that there is something of a continuum or a spectrum of plurality. Nothing exists in nature, in biology, and so on, that does not exist on something of a bell curve. So here we're describing some of these things, and it may or may not map to what this map looks like. I mean, it may not be like, the stuff on the far right may not be more plural than the stuff on the left. It's just, we moved it around until all the lines made sense. All the lines we drew, like, had to, not confuse the eye too much. So as a designer, we mapped it out so it was neat and as orderly and stuff as possible. So this is not necessarily describing the plural bell curve, but some of these things will be found along the plural bell curve, if you will. So we have your singular people in the little pink cloud up here. We have, okay, we'll start with the blue and then explain the things that link to it. How's that? We have several different types of subclinical, non-trauma-based plural systems. So these people do not qualify for a DID diagnosis because they are not as disturbed or dysfunctional or distressed. Sorry, instead of disturbed, let's say distressed, as others may be. And that is not to say that people cannot qualify for, where is DID on here? Anyway, I think over here somewhere. This is not to say that people cannot qualify for DID if they fall into any of the other categories. We'll get to that when we talked about quagenic, way over here. Where we get to the land of confusion, off in the corner opposite from, at least as far as this diagram goes, opposite from singularity. So we have the subclinical folk who are way here. So your aspected singlets, people who will say, well, everybody has parts. That the whole premise behind internal family systems theory, complexes from Jung, and so on, go into the aspected singlets category and then bleed out into the rest of plurality when it gets more and more delineated. But people who have very highly delineated personalities, when they are in different roles in their life, they have strong parts. They may actually sense their inner child to some degree, but it's not actually a separate person. It's some part of them, almost like they're facets on a six-sided die. And, you know, is the number 1 pip showing, or is the number 2 pip showing at the moment? And they're all part of one thing, but they have some definite faces. Those are aspected singlets. And it does get confusing. Are they plural or are they not plural? They kind of fit in this gray category. The same thing goes for borderline personality disorder, which is disordered, which is why it's not subclinical. But borderline personality disorder are people who are also heavily aspected, but they have a clinical presentation. But they have very highly delineated switches of personality or parts. Or if you're going to get into over here where the theory of structural dissociation lives, you know, they have the theory of structural dissociation stuff kind of going on. The other subclinical non-trauma based plural system type is paragenic systems. Anybody who has purposefully created their own other folk to keep them company in their life and in their head or their body. And when we get to the other section, we will be talking about created residents in a system. Residents meaning alters or spirits or whoever is living inside of that body. So paragenic systems, including tulpomancy, which is people who made their own tulpas, for example. Where to go next? Natural systems, including endogenic and so on, may be subclinical, and so they kind of branch off here. Median is a community term for what is now being called in the ICD-11 PDID or partial VID, which both kind of describe a very similar idea of one very strong person fronting and many others, or less distinct others, in the background who are like supporting cast in a way. I mean, they're not any less important, but they don't front. So they are less likely to be spotted by a clinician, but they may be reported, like, I don't know why I do these things. So they exert passive influence. They may be heard and contribute in the background. They may send a lot of emotional content to the person fronting. They may encourage or cajole the fronting person to do things they want or need done, and so on. So median systems and or PDID do not ask us how to tell apart median and PDID from schizophrenia. This is not our job. That's your job if you're a professional. You figure it out. But we will say that that's where things start getting a little wiggly, and maybe somewhere somebody will figure out the magic way of figuring out when it's one or the other, and they can tell me. Well, once we are starting to point at PDID, we may as well come over here and talk about the parallel development of self-states. So this is the theory that everybody was born with separated self-states that are discrete from one another when you're born, and that somehow, by some miracle, they're supposed to all naturally come together if you lead a life free of trauma. But if, I'm going to say, with an educated guess, if you have the proclivity towards dissociation and there is sufficient trauma, that they don't actually come together, and that the person can have parallel development. So all of those self-states do not mesh into one. They actually stay and remain separated and grow together as a group, individually but together. So that is one way that all of these things could happen. There's dash lines, you know, for whatever reason I used dash lines at the time. It's been a while since I made this. But there's dashed lines showing that this theory kind of connects to these kinds of systems. So you have your PDID, your endogenic or natural systems, even your aspected singlets kind of probably grew up without their separate self states completely meshing together. They kind of grew up a little bit compartmentalized, but not too much. And then your borderline personality disorder folk who theories say, or my theory says, maybe they got similar damage to what would happen with DID, but they did it a little later, like instead of before 9, maybe it was before 11 or before 13 or whatever, But whatever reason, the person ends up in this category where they started coming together and then fell apart again, or something like that. We probably should have made this another color. No, actually we don't, because that's actually a person too. Okay, so we'll talk about them in a moment. We'll get there. So the other parallel development is your non-core based DID systems. Okay, we'll get to why we're talking about core in a moment. This is another part of our theories. So the non-core based DID, OSDD, DDNOS systems are systems, plural, or DID systems that have no identifiable core or original headmate, if you will, which is very similar to those who are core-based, which we'll get to in a moment. So this is your classic DID. We're not making a difference between whether there's a memory difference or not. There's a type of OSDD that is more similar to PDID or median. So maybe we should have put the other type of OSDD over here, but it's okay. I think you can stick with us on this, right? Hopefully. I don't have to go changing this in the middle of the presentation. So these guys here are all clinically presented as being trauma-based or traumagenic types of plural systems. So these are all systems that that have been through undue trauma and need help. They are on the pathway for recovery and they need assistance. They are distressed. They are having problems, which is median systems can be trauma-based and can not be more like natural systems, which is why they're over here. But yeah, they can fall over here on this side of the thing. Okay. So clinical are these 4 categories here. Okay, so let's come down to this theory. This is the older theory that was supplanted by the theory of structural dissociation. However, there are systems it still fits for, so we are mentioning it here. And this is the idea that people can become plural even though their psyche had started to, actually it is part of theory of structural dissociation as well, that you can become plural again once you have already come together. So your non-core base, we suspect, we don't know for sure, are people who whose trauma started before they started coming together. How do I explain that better? Okay, in childhood development, somewhere, say around 5 years old, it is theorized that the different self states of a person start to naturally merge, we mentioned before. What happens if the trauma started before that? So now you have not come together as a singular person or starting the process of becoming a singular person. Now you have all of these self states that are developing in parallel. That's people up here, right? This is connected to all of those types of systems. So the trauma started before the merging. There's no sense of the person we would have become had this not happened, because whatever it was happened too early for that process to have started. So what we have down here is similar to the older theory, but it's still part of structural dissociation, where you are born, you have all these different self states. You reach a certain age, things are starting to come together. You start having a sense of identity of who the I is that you are becoming. But then some kind of trauma hits and you fall apart again. So whatever it is requires that you cordon things off and separate and dissociate and so on. So there is a difference in the subjective experience here, because you have this strong sense of having been on the verge of, or already having had, a fully formed singular personality, but you lost it. So that is these people. So these systems are DID, OSDD, or DDNOS folk who have a more identifiable core or original person, or somebody they feel they split off of. They have much more of a sense of having almost reached unity and then being torn apart again by trauma. So this leaves a different mindset for some people, where they feel like they almost had something, like that thing in your tooth that you almost got it out. They had this almost something, and then they lost it. There are folk who have RA, which is ritual abuse. The S is for a deity from the underworld. Well, I don't want to say it. So there are SRA or RA systems who may have become plural later in life. So there are those who still had the parallel development and it started really early. There are those who fall into these categories, but there are also adults who may fall into this category. I left out MC, which is mind control. That there were experiments by the government that tried to see whether or not people could be manipulated by torture, and so on. So we have a category here for people who may even have become adolescents or adults before the trauma that caused them to fall apart. Just in case anybody fits in that category, there are some people who do think that they were one person, something happened later in life, they fell apart. It may be later shown, as they do their trauma work and stuff, that it happened even earlier. But we're going to include them in this chart because we know, due to the research done by governments and so on, that it's at least on the table as a possibility that under extreme circumstances somebody can fall apart again, even later in life. So I'm leaving it there. So any kind of forced, as opposed to voluntary over here, but forced plurality would be here, along with the idea that links these guys together, that alters can be created on purpose. And of course we have the heavily, what do you want to call it? Heavily disputed category of iatrogenic issues, where plurality may or may not be created accidentally in therapy or by hypnosis, where it's created in a clinical environment, and that is hotly contested, and there's a lot of evidence to and fro about it, but we're putting it on the chart to say that, there is this idea that alters can be created on purpose, and we have these people here who are doing it and putting themselves in MRI machines to prove it, and we have these people here who have a very long history of talking about it. We also have some possible suspicion that this is actually a real thing that could happen, that it's a lot less common than people might want to prove in a court of law, but it should actually be a part of the conversation amongst all of these other things. Okay, so aside from the scientific developmental stuff that's on this chart, we have two other important categories to discuss, which is the paranormal category. So we start getting into cultural issues and cultural plurality here. The paranormal category is the theory that there may be other ways to become plural that defy medical explanation, that have not yet been studied anywhere else in this chart. And of course, there the idea that is paranormal is for the spiritual systems mostly. So these are folk that attribute becoming plural to having some kind of spiritual experience where somebody moves into their body, not necessarily asked to move in, or where they have talents and they actually recruited or welcomed folk into their body on purpose. So then there starts to be a little bit of a similarity to paragenic, where it's done purposefully. So it could be purposefully or not so purposefully, but that it's their own talent intrinsically that allowed it to happen. Then there is the question category here, the theory that the true origins of plurality are ineffable, unknowable, unreliable. I mean, look at all this mess. Unreliable and possibly unimportant, or none of anybody's business. So that leads us to the group of people who call themselves quadgenic, which is kind of a dual personal label. So endogenic, traumagenic, quadgenic, these are all community labels. So this is a community label that systems use when they have too many of these other things going on, or they haven't figured it out yet, even though they've tried, or they're just done with trying to figure it out and they just want to get on with living, and so on. So it is the quadgenic from je ne sais quoi, meaning what, or I don't know what. It's that ineffable thing that, I can't put a finger on it, I don't want to put a finger on it, and I'm going to put my finger in the air and tell you off. Those are kind of bundled into quadgenic. So they may have given up figuring out how they came about, or they know that they're in many categories and don't want to have to bother explaining themselves. All right. I think... Oh, we have to get to the center. Okay. So a goal for many plural systems is reaching functional multiplicity. Note we did not put anything on here about the goal that some people have to try to become singular again. I don't know why we didn't exactly, but Oh yeah, no, we did actually. Ha ha ha. So functional multiplicity, which former clinical what? Oh, former clinical systems that are now non-clinical systems in remission. So all the folk that get diagnoses in this diagram, and possibly iatrogenic, may have a goal of becoming functionally multiple eventually. Otherwise, they may want full merge, final fusion, integration, and so on. So this would be the functional multiple, or they somehow hyper jump back to singular over here, which would have been really awkward to put a bunch of arrows to, so we didn't. So it is kind of here in the middle. So everybody has this goal of, for whatever reason, whether they're singular or plural at the end, becoming more functional. So what is inside of a plural system also has a range of broad categories, and again, this is not definitive, this is not the be-all and end-all. We may have left things out, we apologize if we did, but these are some of the common types of folk that we find inside of plural systems. And this is just on their origin, how they came about. So this is any or all types of residents. This is not their roles. This is how they came about, or the types of, viscerally types of residents that they are. So any or all of these can inhabit in any one specific system. So somebody could have one or more than one of everything on the menu. It's not exhaustive. It's not trying to be a list of everything possible out there, but it is all of the ones that we could think of that crossed our plate, that we've come across or we have ourselves. So here they are, and again we will talk about the blue things before talking about the specifics to make it a little easier, hopefully, to organize the talk. So all of them, if you notice the center of this here, points to all of them. They are all subjective because none of these can be observed by science. These are all completely subjective, not externally observable. They're based on client history or clinical and spiritual theories, and on the altar's own identity within their system. Altar for the, we prefer resident, so the resident's personal identity. And it's a representative sample. Not all of the lenses that you can view plurality through acknowledge all of these. And so that's where we split them off into different things, because different theories and different lenses acknowledge different things. I have to tell my thing not to disturb me. How do I do that? It's not giving me my do not disturb. Oh, you pain. That's annoying. Alright. My little control panel wasn't giving me my do not disturb. Okay. So, everybody is subjective on this map. But they are also acknowledged by certain theories. So let's start here. Internal observation. So these are subjective experience, internally created residents. Splits. So that's back to the old theory, or the theory that people came together and then fell apart again. So somebody splintered off, or we had a 5-year-old kid who stayed 5 but also became a 6-year-old kid, so now they both came out of the same kid. Or like when somebody is 11 and then they discover that their 6-year-old self like separated from them, I don't know, or something, whatever. So like all the different ways that that you can have a sense of whole or more wholeness and then fall into smaller, not smaller, but become like new people, like kind of like a hierarchy kind of thing. Like you have a family tree. So it's kind of like having a family tree. Everybody came out of this one thing and split off into all these different branches. So those are splits. Subpersonalities are subclinical observations of self as many or parts of self. Subpersonalities comes from, I believe it kind of comes from Jungian psychology and internal family systems theory and so on. I think we did put polypsychism. Hey, look at that. This is a little bit of an older chart. I think we added some stuff. And then creations, which are whether purposefully or accidentally created. They are tulpas and puppets and thought forms, golems, functional fragments, things that we create out of our own mind space. So these are generally figured out by internal observation and not and through like personal internal experience that these things happen. Soul loss is a cultural plurality concept that comes out of shamanism or the neo-shamanic works of Michael Harner and Sandra Ingerman. But, you know, they attribute it to the indigenous folk that they spent time with in various countries and came up with these concepts called core shamanism that kind of bridged several tribes. So they were looking for commonalities between different tribes on different concepts. And so the concept of soul loss being very close to the concepts of traumatic injury. So these are bits of essence of psychic energy or psyche that have separated off due to traumatic impacts and gotten lost in the shamanic world. And these lenses also believe in mediumship and possession and walk-ins and past life and ancestors and things like that you can still commune with these wise beings and so on. So we kind of mentioned those in there. So there's a bunch of cultural stuff hidden in this one here. We have our clinical observation stuff. A clinical observer can use these terms to describe their client, and these are parts of the theoretical models and the structural models of plurality, that the original idea that people split, now the idea of the ANP and the EP from theory of structural dissociation, and that all of these self-states did not integrate or fell apart again afterwards. So parts are parts of a whole person, and very clinical lens there, and then introjects, which is still parts according to clinical observation, but these parts took on a extraordinary influence from external models or role models. So this would include Freud's superego, would be introjected morals and codes from your family, for example. Internal family systems, where you actually supposedly introject family members, but also includes in DID and so on, internalized persecutors or internalized abusers, internalized carers and caregivers, and so on. So those would be introjects. We didn't write it in here, but in introjects also includes what is called in the community factives and fictives. Fictives are from fiction. Factives are real people. They can be historical figures, they can be current figures, they can be people you knew personally, or people more idealized, like celebrities or such. So those would all fall under the introject category, but the words used might change depending on who you're talking to. Which brings us to internalized residents. These are all people that are internal headmates or residents who are subconsciously copied, but not necessarily deliberately copied from external role models. Soul bonds is in a little weird category there, because if you're writing a book and your own character comes to life in your head, was it an external model or an internal model because you're the one that wrote the book? I don't know, but whatever. So when your characters come to life, and you are the author of the book, but suddenly you find yourself having an argument in your own head with your character, that would be a soul bond, or a soul bond attempting to exert itself and become more real, possibly. So that's the characters that come to life, including some types of fictives and so on. And the idea of internalized residents subconsciously copied from external inspiration can include system hopping. At least, it could be. I mean, it could be a mystical experience. It could be that you're, making a copy of another person's headmate. Either way. So this could be spiritual or not, which is why it is down here in the potentially spiritual area. So all of these bottom ones are different types of headmates that can be considered to be something of spiritual or metaphysical or whatever. So these are internal observation of either real people or spiritual entities who have taken up residence in your system, which is why we call it residence instead of some other weird word, because these are all residents in your body. So, the idea that these alters are really actually separate people who have had or still have an autonomous life of their own, even though they're sharing your body with you. So, system hopping, because they came from another system. So system A and system B share a headmate, or a headmate originated in system A, but sometimes goes and visits system B. There is nothing inherently wrong with the idea as long as it's not forced or toxic or coerced. But it is as real as any of these other things here. Which is to say, it is entirely subjective, and it's not really anybody outside of their body's business whether it's real or not, so long as nobody's getting hurt. Let's start on the familiar end. Everybody's heard of mediums. So mediumship is where you regard plurality as something of a gift or a talent, and you hear voices, channel spirits, or speak to external beings, and sometimes they're temporary and sometimes they have an extended stay, or you have constant communication with them, and so on. So this might also include speaking to spirit guides or stuff, which is why it's over here towards soul loss, because these kind of have some joint concepts in this area. Possession, which is actually mentioned in the DSM criteria, that it can seem like possession. Well, this is when you feel like it's that you're possessed. So this is generally seen as residency or some kind of like an illness or a symbiotic relationship that's unwanted and undesirable. It can be desired, but then I would lean towards calling it more mediumship. So there are positive possession states, which I would put into this category here. This is the undesirable lens, I guess, of looking at headmates. Polypsychism is a philosophy / transpersonal concept of there being more than one soul in a body, and thus if you have more than one soul, you have more than one potential psyche to go along with them. And this is straight out of psychology and philosophy, and not particularly mystical, but it's still transpersonal, so we're lumping it into the kind of spiritual category. But this is out there in the literature. We're not making it up. Then there's walk-ins. So the classic definition of a walk-in is a fugue. So a fugue state is there is a switch in personality and the person takes off and does not come back. Like they completely change their identity, move to a new town, and that's it. They're done. Like they have switched and switched permanently. Usually the other person may or may not come back. A complete change of identity. So walk-in, original idea was that somebody left the body and somebody else walked into it, so a spirit would enter the body, because nature abhors a vacuum, I guess. So one takes off, the other one moves in, and it's like you wake up and you're in a new place, a new body, you have no memory of the former life, and what do you do with that? So that's one form of walk-in. There's a lot of us who use the term walk-in when a group of residents moved into our body. One or more residents moved into our body even though everybody else did not move out. So these are considered to be spirits or otherworldly beings or ghosts or whatever that have taken up permanent residence in our body. So as opposed to the type that's a fugue and a swap, now this is, just permanent residence. Past life aspects, there can be headmates or subsystems and so on that are entirely based around the idea that somebody in your body has a bunch of past lives. And, you can be singular with past life aspects, so this could be one of the types of aspected singularity, where somebody has a lot of contact with their own past lives, and they can maybe change their mode of looking at the world and relating to the world depending on which past life they connect to most. So this is also found in singular folk who perhaps are on the more mystical, spiritual side of things and have a lot of connection to their past. And gateway systems, which you find a little bit more of in like the otherkin community, but the idea of a gateway system is my body is a portal, or I have many portals within my inner world or my body, and my residents came from somewhere else, and they can come in and out and go and come back, or the first gateway system we met, their inner world was a whole planet, and there was a kind of like an amusement or like a relic or something, like an amusement park entertainment thing or a relic in their head that they could go visit, almost like it was a monument. So they could go to this monument and interface with the body on Earth. And so they had what would be viewed by a psychology lens, a very highly polyfragmented system where almost never the same person twice. Maybe there was like one or two people who would repeat visit, but that it was kind of like a revolving door with lots of people from this other world coming through and like, oh, okay, hi, this is Earth. Oh, wow, this is cool. All right, I get to do these things and then go back. And never come back again. So that's one way of being a gateway system. Our way of being a gateway system is we do have a permanent structure of an internal world, like a closed universe. It's a spaceship, kind of like Starship Enterprise or whatever. And instead of it being a whole world and us coming and going, we actually have portals out to other worlds. So some of us go out of body to our home worlds where we used to live, get to walk around as a ghost on these other worlds. We don't take our body with us, but some of us are between lives and stuff. But we go to these other worlds, we walk around, and we come back here. So our rubber band, our soul connection or whatever is now to this body, but we can go out and visit other places and come back. And that's like one whole section of our system. There's a section that's a classic DID section of our system, and we consider ourselves quadgemic because who wants to explain this to everybody? So we're quadgemic, but just in terms of talking about gateway systems, there are many ways to be a gateway system. So either the residents in the inner world are in another world, or they're from another world, and you still have links to those other worlds, basically. And this body is or can contain portals to other worlds. That is, yes, I know it is out there, but it is there. It is an idea, and there are more than one person with that idea, so it is on the list. So all of that said, the other thing to mention, which is not on any of these lists, is the idea of polyfragmented. So polyfragmented is a layered system with many layers of the stuff here at the top going on. So like what I was just saying about our polyfragmented system, we have a quadgenic identified system that has a non-core based group of kids, so one subsystem or a group of residents who are from a classic DID system, but they also how do we put it? So they opened a portal to the spirit world and invited a bunch of passing by spirits in. So now we get down to the types of residents who are walk-ins, and then later on many of us rebuilt portals out of our system back to our home worlds, and we became a gateway as well. So we have a group of walk-ins and we're a gateway system. We have some interjects and yeah, like splits and stuff. Anyway, and soul loss, but that deserves some caveats of its own that are outside of the scope of the presentation. Hopefully this is helpful for people to understand some of the terminology that you might hear within the plural community. Hopefully it's helpful for clinicians to understand there's a heck of a lot going on outside of your tiny little corner of plurality here. Whether here or over here where, you have like a few more diagnoses, and maybe you can see the idea of the difference between these two types of DID, which does actually lead to people having different ideas about how they want to handle their plurality and how much trouble they have with their plurality. But, there's these things out here in these wilds that are not always covered in the literature. And we will probably have to have a similar presentation just about polyfragmentation at some point to go into the whole idea of plurality inside of plurality is really what subsystems kind of are. Although in our case, yes, it's still like that, but it's complicated. So once you get to the complicated systems, they're complicated, believe it or not. So this is complicated enough for now. Let me read this bubble because I did not. Any or all styles of plurality may apply to or within a specific system or subsystem. So a system that is classic DID, one of these two, can have other things going on in there. So there may be other types of plural experiences that are not represented here. We're sorry if we missed whatever your type of plurality is. And this is an attempt to capture some of the more well-known or better documented experiences of plurality. And it will be part of our Introduction to Plurality for Professionals course that we're working on. So we hope you have a lovely day, and hopefully this wasn't too long, and we will make sure that the PDF for this and a PNG or whatever will be available in the course. Enjoy and have a great day.